Welcome to the finals of Grand Prix Las Vegas. Matt Sperling and Numatanami Kenji here in the booth with me. Scott Markeson is going to be on the play by virtue of the Swiss standings, and both players are going to get started here with a Glenhawk Idol for Scott Markeson and a Blinkmoth Nexus for David Heineman.
So both pretty decent starts. We'll see if Heineman has a 2-drop to match Scott's. Looks like he's just attacking in for 1. You don't want to see that. You want to actually put more presence on the board, I think.
Yeah, I see a lot of land in David Heineman's hand.
It's going to be hard for David to come back if Scott just plays, another artifact creature, activates the Glenhawk Idol, and has 2 creatures to David Heineman's effectively 1.
Yeah, Scott seems to be thinking about which artifact to play. I assume that he has one just given the number that are in his deck.
Mm-hmm. This time it's going to be a Kite Sail. Okay.
I think that bodes pretty well. On balance for David, it's not a card that threatens you by itself. So David does get a little bit of breathing room, as Kite Sail is the turn 3 play for Scott.
Exactly, I agree. I see David Heineman has a Mirror Enforcer in his hand, but he does not have any artifacts, at least not until he activates the
Sickle Slicer will be David's first artifact. With it comes a 2/2 Germ.
It's not too exciting, but at least that is an artifact for his metal or affinity.
Yeah, he really had to at least get started on turn 3,
Exactly.
since the turn 2 brought nothing.
We'll see if Scott has a 4-drop he can do here, potentially, if he even has that 4th land.
Darksteel Citadel would unlock Mirror Enforcer for Scott. I mentioned in our preview that both players taking advantage of the synergy between Darksteel Citadel and Mirror Enforcer. There's Darksteel Citadel, Glenhawk Idol attacks. We'll see if Mirror Enforcer is also in Scott's hand. Doesn't look like it.
You see 3 mana play a Somber Hoverguard, a nice one from Scott's side. David doesn't have any flyers beyond that land, and he doesn't want to block and activate. It just trades away.
All right, so David, multiple land in hand. There's always a risk of mana flood when you're a 2-color aggressive deck. It's just something that I think a lot of people you just have to look out for it in this format.
Yeah, and big draw here for Scott. Just having creatures, I guess, as opposed to David, who's completely flooding out.
Yeah, if David takes this turn, off, so to speak, to cast Thoughtcast, he's already behind and is in grave danger of falling too far behind.
Yeah. Like we mentioned before, though, he does have that triple Vapor Snag. That could buy him enough time if he's able to draw into some of those.
It is going to be Thoughtcast. It's not a great option, but it looked like David's only option. 2 cards included Sunlance.
I think other was the Darksteel Citadel, the Darksteel Axe.
All right, well, Sunlance has to be one of the cards that David was hoping to draw. It'll knock out the Somber Hoverguard potentially for only 1 white mana. There's Cathodian, 5 points in the air, make the Cathodian also fly and say go. So Scott, that's a pretty productive turn.
Mm-hmm. Again, like you mentioned before, Sunland's going to do a good job here. A very cheap, efficient removal spell, potentially getting David back into the game. Does he have any other ways to deal with Scott's flyers, though? It doesn't look like it. Again, that Mirror Enforcer is still sitting there.
Yeah, Flare Husk is a little bit late to the party, as is Darksteel Axe. So basically, Thoughtcast had to be cast for 4. Mirror Enforcer hasn't even been cast yet because the cheap artifacts, like I said, just showed up a little bit late. We do see Sunlance knock out one of the flyers in Cathodian.
The nice thing for David is that, the Flare Husk and the Darksteel Axe are basically free if he's going to play the Mirror Enforcer in the same turn, since they only cost 1.
It's got to be time for that Blinkmoth Nexus to represent a trade.
I believe so.
If you're not familiar with the card Blinkmoth Nexus, it becomes a 1/1 flying creature, but it also has another ability. 1 in tap, target Nexus gets +1/+1. It itself is a Nexus, so all that taken together means you can block and make a 2/2 creature with it with 2 other mana. David's going to leave up exactly that play. Plains, Island, Blinkmoth Nexus, activate it for 1, block, then pump it for another 1, would represent a trade for either the Somber Hoverguard or the Glenhawk Idol.
And I think that's a good point, Matt. A lot of people, I think, forget that the Blinkmoth Nexus can pump itself. I think Scott, rereading the card, realizes that's what it can do, though.
Exactly. He picked it up, he read it, so we can actually see that he's cognizant of what that card can do, and he'll have to decide whether he wants to trade with it or not.
I assume he's going to play an artifact pre-combat here to trigger that Glinthawk again. Oh, I see a Cranial Plating coming down.
Wow. You know what that does is it's going to, if nothing else, it's going to force David to trade with the less desirable of the attackers. It equips to Glenhawk Idol. David goes ahead and activates Blinkmoth Nexus as I expected. It's going to block Glenhawk Idol, pump itself like we talked about. That forces a trade. The bad news for David is that the cranial plating sticks around and the pressure is really still on him here.
There's a slight upside that the artifact did die, so the cranial plating, while still very, very threatening, at least gets reduced by 1. Let's see what the draw was for David. He's going to need something.
I think it was a Frogmite. That's really not the right answer. It's not an answer at all. It's a creature without flying against Kite Sail, Somber Hoverguard, cranial plating. I don't even see a way for David to survive.
No, if he doesn't have a flyer, or a tap down, or a bounce.
Yeah, there's an Argent Sphinx. Is there a second blue?
Doesn't look like it. Looks like Scott Markeson's going to take game 1 here with just the virtue of the flyers and the equipment spells.
Yeah, I think it's worth taking stock of the difference in styles. Scott Markeson's deck much more aggressively positioned. David Heineman much more concerned about card advantage. So Thoughtcast is a card that draws 2 cards and puts you ahead in terms of total number of cards that you've drawn and seen. It does put you behind on the board. Scott's been using that to his advantage all game.
Other cards that David might have been looking for: Dispatch, not current. Well, it would be active now, so that would have been a nice removal spell for him to hit. He does have a few flyers like the Skyhunter Skirmisher as well. But as it stands, Scott just has him dead on board.
All right, Scott untaps, not wasting much time here, just kind of double checking. Kitetail joins Alloy Mirror. Now both creatures are 3/2 flying. Cranial plating represents a +4/+0. Don't forget about that artifact land in Scott's back row. Between the 4 from cranial plating, the 6 from the flyers, 10 damage total. And Scott certainly understands that, just thinking about, which creature to equip in case something goes wrong.
Exactly. And with only 1 blue open, there's only that 1 card in the format, Vapor Snag.
Yeah, Dismember would be no help. I take that back. Dismember would be.
Oh no, you're right. It would. He was left at 1. Yeah.
So something worth thinking about. Not actually relevant in that game. Scott Markeson takes the first game of our finals here at Grand Prix Las Vegas. I'm Matt Sperling, Kenji Egashira next to me. We're going to start talking about the sideboard options. For Scott Markeson, the best sideboard card I see on either sheet of paper in front of me is that Tarashi's Grasp. David Heineman, having looked over his list, the best option I saw was perhaps Gut Shot. Gut Shot's a card that can present a surprise element, and in fact, I do see that he reached for it, and that's going to enter a sleeve. What I mean by surprise element is that it costs 1 Phyrexian red mana, 0 actual mana, and when you're tapped out, Scott Markeson might end up planning out a turn with equipment or blockers that Gut Shot can kind of break up.
Yeah, I mean, he saw that Gust Skimmer at the later end part of the game, so I could easily take out that or just any random X one. For David Heineman, I mean, he has other sideboard cards. He has Iona. I don't think that's correct to bring in for this matchup.
Certainly not.
Yeah. Other cards like Nameless Inversion, Plummet. He'd have to go into another color, but I just don't think he wants to do that.
Well, pretty interesting. Sundering, Vitae, and Plummet. That's I think from his perspective, though, he would have to remove something like Argent Sphinx from his deck to get into those.
Correct.
It's something I would consider. I'm not sure that it's something I don't know that I'd be willing to give up Muldrifter and Argent Sphinx to do it, but I would spend a few seconds at least thinking about it.
Sure, those cards are just basically, vindicates against the opposing artifact deck.
On balance, I wouldn't, and with Vapor Snags, I mean, there's just too many colored spells in David Heineman's deck for him to strip them out in favor of a couple sideboard cards.
So would you consider Wings of Velas Veil for Scott? I don't think that card is maybe very good, but David didn't have many flyers, and in conjunction with equipment could potentially just prove to be, a few points of damage.
Yeah, it would serve 2 functions. It could take out an opposing Glenhawk Idol that attacked, kind of unwittingly, or it could present a lethal attack on an equipped creature, since it only affects base power and toughness. It's possible that Scott decided to bring that in. Probably not.
No, yeah, he already has the Kite Sail too, so looks like players are opting to mulligan or not.
Yeah, Scott appears to have kept his opening 7.
Well, I think David's choosing first, right?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
I'm not sure where his hand is. Maybe he's leaning back, thinking about it long and hard.
Yeah, being down a game, David, by all appearances, had a kind of hand on the border and wasn't willing to risk it, whatever it was, elects to mulligan.
These players are in the finals here of this GP.
Grand Prix Las Vegas, we've got our final round here. One of these players is about to be crowned champion. Talk for a moment about how a deck like Blue-White Affinity mulligans. Is it a deck that mulligans well? It's a deck that is, has poor 6-card hands. How do you evaluate that?
You know, it depends on what type of affinity list you're building. If you're the actual affinity list and you mulligan into a hand with 3 lands, Mirror Enforcer, Frogmite, something like that, it's not where you want to be. But if you're like David Heineman's or even Scott's deck, they're both very, very aggressive. You have great 6s that you can have.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Darksteel Axe and Spectral Procession is only 2 cards,
Yep.
but then again, Mirror Enforcer is a card that you need a number of resources to even get
Exactly.
it out. Again, we see first turn Blinkmoth Nexus for David.
Court Homunculus for Scott, a good start over there.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, really huge, bigger than it looks, the Court Homunculus, because all the tempo that David had by going first is already evaporated.
Yep.
Court Homunculus is going to be the first, real creature besides Blinkmoth Nexus, and then any artifact from Scott Markeson here represents 2 damage from the Court Homunculus and another threat, possibly, if the artifact is a creature.
Yeah, if Scott has any kind of curve, he's looking in great shape.
That creature is Mirrorsmith, not an artifact yet, so 1 damage from the Court Homunculus knocks David to 19. Mirrorsmith, though, a powerful 2-drop.
Yeah, if you guys remember Scars of Mirrodin block, Mirrorsmith could quickly get out of hand with all of the 1-mana artifacts, and we might see that here in this game too.
All right, Sickle Slicer, a really nice card in any situation where you're looking to block, because it'll leave behind that A, an artifact for your affinity count, and B, an equipment to use later in the game. Mirrorsmith sees its first trigger off of a Gust Skimmer.
We're going to see a 1-1 go into play. Now, Scott did not elect to attack yet.
He may be mulling it over and does decide not to trade Court Homunculus for a Germ token. So David Heineman able to kind of stabilize with only that 1/2/2 Germ token. What's he going to do now to pull ahead?
Sure, I think in his hand he has a Skyhunter Skirmisher. That would be pretty good against all the X1s currently on the board. It would stop the Gust Skimmer from attacking just because of the double strike, and it even flies already, so it's probably a good play for David.
That's absolutely right. It represents an effective blocker and threatens to be an effective attacker.
Although I think I also saw was that a Spectral Procession in his hand?
Wow,
Oh,
Swans of Briss Argyle and Spectral Procession in David's hand, and now Swans on the battlefield. This just got really interesting. Swan's not a great blocker because it generates cards for your opponent. What that Swans does, it's a bird spirit, 4/3 flying. Whenever it takes damage, you prevent that damage, and the controller of the damage source, draws that many cards. The long story short of that is that if it blocks a 2-power creature, yes, it'll kill the creature, but Scott would then draw 2 cards.
Oh, so Scott played and finally drew the trump card that we were talking about earlier, that Lodestone Mirror. So now in conjunction with Mirrorsmith, he can make the Lodestone Mirror a huge trampling artifact.
Absolutely.
Wow, this is...
Part of the reason Scott was content to not trade off, but just sit here, is that Lodestone Mirror is an absolute trump card. It's really hard to block it. It has trample, so it's even hard to chump block it. Mirrorsmith providing perfect fuel for that Lodestone Mirror.
And David looking like he knows he needs to go a little bit offensive here.
Spectral Procession for David Heineman is going to add to his evasive board presence.
You know what? All of a sudden he has 7 power in the air.
And he in a sense drew first blood by getting that first 4-point attack, dropping Scott to 15, while David is still at 19 life.
We might see a David go for a 2-turn clock in the air. That Sickle Slicer could easily move to one of the flyers and you know, if Scott doesn't leave up the Gust skimmer for flying, he could be in a real world of hurt.
Mirror Enforcer and a Mirror Trigger. That's 2 more artifacts for Scott. We're now in what's a very interesting race. David Heineman has a Vapor Snag, which could totally change the math, but I don't think has a blue mana source
He
yet.
has not yet found that blue. And again, he has 3 Vapor Snags in his deck, which are great against the Lodestone Mirror.
Yeah, game 2, anybody's for the taking. 2 powerful draws that don't really interact with each other. It's just going to be a pure race.
Yes. So it looks like Scott's attacking with the mirror, deciding which artifacts he wants to tap to pump that up. Now, he also realizes he needs to get a little bit aggressive here. Like you said before, it's a race in the air or on the ground.
Yeah, one thing that's a little bit non-obvious, with Island up and Gust Skimmer untapped, Scott does have a flying blocker.
Sure. If he wants to, he can even, you know, block the Swans and draw 2 cards that way.
Looked like David drew Sunlance. Some different options with that. Gust Skimmer, Lodestone Mirror. Now, Lodestone Mirror could be pumped to 4/4. Will Scott remember if he blocks to go block, pump the Lodestone Mirror? Kind of a fascinating interaction.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Although, you know, he doesn't have any good targets that he wants to block, right? He doesn't want to trade the Skimmer off for one of the Spirits.
Well, I don't know. Cashing in the Skimmer for 4 life and 2 cards. I would be very tempted to do that.
For the chump on the Swans, sure,
yeah,
sure.
Sure. Okay, so David.
Oh,
there you go.
So, well, the Sunlance he used on the Skimmer
I think
anyways.
both players keenly aware of what was going on. David choosing to remove that blocker, Scott choosing to pump the Lodestone Mirror on the way out in case a second Sunlance was in David Heineman's hand. Some tight technical play, but David Heineman, I think here, with the upper hand, that 2-turn clock in the air.
Yeah, I think he has to at least attack with 6 power in the air just so that he can, you know, prove to have lethal by attaching the Sickle Slicer to one of the Flyers next turn. If he attacks for 6, puts Scott to 9, he'll have lethal.
Yeah, I mean, I think you attack for at least 7, to be honest. You've already got the Germ Token to block, potentially a Nexus to block if you need to,
Sure.
and 14 life is enough that I'm not overly concerned about dying if
Yeah.
I'm in David Heineman's seat. So I expect to see, like you mentioned, at least 6 power, possibly 7 or 8 in the air, 4 from the Swans.
No?
Oh, just double check the math, that's smart. And it is indeed all 7. Scott drops to 8. Glenhawk Idol joins the board. That's another
That's a
blocker
great
and
draw.
or another flyer.
So now David doesn't have to block with the Blinkmock Nexus, because if he didn't have another 4th land, he wouldn't be able to equip the Slicer.
Yeah, David opened up with a marginal hand and mulliganed it. He was really rewarded with a powerful draw, a really evasive draw, and getting the upper hand, but having the play meant that he's in position to potentially win this race.
Mm-hmm. It'd be really interesting if Scott drew his Tarashi's Grasp from the sideboard. He can, you know, kill his own Mirror Enforcer, gain 7 life. But
Absolutely. I haven't got a chance to get a good look at Scott Markeson's hand. You're right that Tarashi's Grasp is one of the cards that could turn this almost, I mean, any flying creature becomes interesting.
yeah. I think this is just a desperation attack, though.
It might be, but then again, I think you make this attack whether you have
Sure.
a flying blocker
Yeah.
or you don't.
All of Heineman's creatures have flying, except the Sickle Slicer, so
So I'm seeing in my preview pane an Arrest. Now, if that's a card that's in Scott Markeson's hand, does that take lethal away from David Heineman if that Swans gets arrested? I think it does.
it also depends on how David's going to choose to block. Remember, he might be a little bit scared. He could have, Scott could have a Fortify for all he knows.
Wow. So an already interesting game could be made much more interesting by what Scott deploys post-combat and by how David Heineman blocks in combat.
David doing a little mental math here. Looks like he's going to activate his Glinthawk Idol. That's a little bit off the screen currently.
And the Germ potentially jumping in front of Mirror Enforcer to prevent 4 damage. Yep. Glenhawk Idol in front of Mirror Smith prevents 2 damage and takes the Mirror Smith off of the board.
Lodestone Mirror getting pumped twice by the 2 untapped Mirror that Scott had.
Yeah, so 6 damage getting through the end result of that, David Heineman falls to 8. Scott Markeson also at 8. The arrest that we mentioned now on Swanson versus Argyle, that's a huge swing.
Yeah.
What was once lethal is now only, 4, maybe 5 damage on David Heineman's side of the board?
Now, David has to play defense here, I think. He can't afford to put Scott on that 2-turn clock anymore. Again, the Lodestone Mirror having trample is proving to be really, really nice for Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let me ask you this. If David Heineman attacked with just the 3 spirits, can he then survive?
Well, he drew a gut shot for the turn, so his Vapor Snag in hand is still not doing anything. He can activate the Blink Moth, again, like you said before, pumping it itself to make it a 2-2.
So attacking with, let's say, the 3 spirits attack,
Sure.
the Blink Moth Nexus would then have to block the Mirror Enforcer, but that would keep him alive, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it also depends. Like, all Scott needs to do is draw one of the many equipment spells he has, like if a kite sail or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not going to take much at all for Scott to close this out. But I just want to note that David Heineman has a way to play this game and stay alive while threatening lethal.
It's very true. You got to play to your outs here, and
one of the better games we've seen in this top 8 so far.
Certainly. So it looks like he's just attacking with 1. I think you're right, Matt. I think he had to attack with 3 spirits and just hope that Scott didn't draw anything.
Well, you know what? That Sky Hunter skirmisher that just joined David's side of the battlefield, that was the kind of the element that we were missing. Sickle Slicer plus the double striker. David's able to still represent lethal and have additional blockers. That's actually really important on this board, to have an extra blocker or 2 and still be able to threaten lethal.
Now, I wonder if that was almost like chaos confetti there, joining the ranks. We see the microphone. Sorry, guys, for that slight audio or video issue, but interesting game still. Yeah, very much so. And you know what? He had the skirmisher in the hand since the beginning. I think we just forgot about it.
Yeah. An artifact cast just off-screen Cathodian.
Cathodian, okay. So David counting up how many times Scott can pump up that Lodestone Mirror. So forced to make at least one type of jump block here.
Yep, and I think for the second or third turn in a row, it's going to come down to whether Scott has something that can jump in the way of David Heineman's flyers. All right, so some damage trampling through. A total of 5 damage is going to put David to, I believe, 3.
So we're actually going to see the gut shot finish up the game here, funny enough. David's going to equip the Sickle Slicer to the Skirmisher, who's going to double strike in for 6, the Spirit Token getting in for 1, and then gut shot, that final 7.
Oh, wow. There it is. David Heineman able to just barely squeak that out. He's going to be your, he's not going to be your champion yet. We're actually going to now see a game 3.
Yeah.
He's able to even the matchup at 1-1. Interesting. So the player who's been on the play has won both games. That makes a lot of sense given the texture of these games.
And it looks like, I think David might have used the Vapor Snag instead. I didn't actually see him cast that gut shot, but he did draw an island that last turn.
No, I think our life total was just wrong.
Oh, okay,
The Spirit had dropped Scott down to 7.
Gotcha. All right.
Falling down to 7 meant that the double strike 6, the other Spirit 1, finished off Scott. You're right that the gut shot was there just in case, but David did not have to show it, which could end up mattering.
All right. Well, at least we get a game 3 here for our finals against pretty evenly matched decks, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, we've already got our money's worth with that second game. I think one of the best games that we saw all weekend. A real back and forth. Scott looked like he pulled ahead with a rest. David Heineman pulled right back in it with Sky Hunter Skirmisher.
It doesn't look like either player opted to make any additional sideboard plans, so I think they're content with how they did. Again, if Scott can draw his Tarashi's Grasp, I think that's just going to be one of the hugest or the biggest swinging points of any of these games.
Yeah, you think about the life gain on that card, kind of an afterthought as you're evaluating how strong it is. But in this matchup, not the case. Both players racing with evasive creatures, or in Scott Markeson's case, kind of has sometimes bigger and better creatures, and the ability to gain life potentially huge.
And remember, a lot of these artifact cards cost more than they actually, cost to play.
Yeah, that's certainly true in the case of a Frogmite or a Mirror Enforcer.
Both of which are in David's deck. For all of you Nightbirds out there, if you're just tuning in, this is the finals of Grand Prix Las Vegas, presented by Channel Fireball. In the booth, I'm Kenji Egashira with Matt Sperling. Looks like a little token got...
A Spirit token was in David Heineman's deck. That's why you don't sleeve your tokens. So that's not an issue. It's removed from the deck, and David draws his opening hand of 7 cards.
What do we see here? Do we see a good mix of land and spells? I see a plains, an island. It looks like both players kept immediately.
Yeah, so both players happy with their initial 7. David Heineman, with a number of affinity cards in his deck, it's important for that turn 1 artifact to come down. Scott Markeson, nothing on turn 2. David Heineman, nothing on turn 2.
Now this is the first time we haven't seen Scott cast anything within the first 2 turns.
Yeah, already, this game already has a different feel to it than the last one.
It looks like he does have at least an option here on turn 3, which is good. David Heineman, we saw in the previous game, has a bunch of ways to produce flyers, so that Darksteel Axe could get very scary.
All right, Sickle Slicer was David Heineman's turn 3 play. This game, it's Scott Markeson's turn 3 play.
Vapor Snag at end of turn is actually going to take care of that Germ token.
So Vapor Snag returns the Germ token to Scott's hand. Because it's a token, of course, it's actually exiled. And then David's able to untap on what's more or less a fresh board, but doesn't have a play of his own.
Wow. So what kind of slower hand would he keep? He must have had an Argent Sphinx, I would assume.
Yeah, or, I mean, Thought Cast maybe, and he was hoping to draw one more artifact.
I actually see another Vapor Snag in his hand.
It's very Mechanist, so that's going to be a way to mitigate flood by providing a 2/2 flyer on board and a look at the top 3. But he misses.
So a Dispatch and Sunlance both went to the bottom. That's huge.
An absolutely huge turn of events, because already looking a little bit heavy on lands, an additional spell would have been a tremendous help.
Oh, Blinding Soul Eater and a Frogmite for 1 mana.
Wow, and with Lodestone Mirror, tapping an artifact has nothing to do with Summoning Sickness, doesn't interact with it at all. So the Frogmite and the Blinding Soul Eater that just joined the battlefield could be tapped if Scott wanted to. Scott decides not to tap either.
Yeah, so he saw the Sunlance game 1 or game 2, and he's actually playing around it, but we know from this end that it's on the bottom of David's library.
Yeah, we know that, but you're absolutely right that Scott's not going to allow David in this particular situation to get out of this using Sunlance.
Exactly.
Not with Sickle Slicer there to potentially put it forever out of Sunlance range. David, no choice but to crack right back.
Hitting for 4 in the air and a Tumble Magnet, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, very nice. Both players now with an ability to tap down. Tumble Magnet for David, Blinding Soul Eater for Scott.
So I wonder if David's going to use the Tumble Magnet almost defensively, tapping Scott's Blinding Soul Eater, but that seems almost awful since he could just tap it in response to Pump the Mirror.
Well, normally I wouldn't expect to see that play. With Vapor Snag in David's hand, it actually wouldn't surprise me that much.
Sure.
If David says, okay, you can go ahead and attack with Lodestone Mirror. I'll take 4 or 5 this turn, then I'll use Vapor Snag to try to swing the race later. It's going to be a key turning point either way, whether it's, as far as how David Heineman decides to proceed.
I agree. Scott's hand a little off our screen, but he is holding quite a big grip, debating on what kind of things he wants to do.
You know, I think I might have seen Tarashi's Grasp in there.
Oy.
Fairy Mechanist is going to be how Scott gets started. We'll see if he has more good fortune than David Heineman had.
Looks like he kept a Court Homunculus there, okay.
Yeah, every artifact counts with that Lodestone Mirror. Every artifact counts by virtue of David Heineman having not much of a board presence.
So going to combat, David's going to use one of the Tumble Magnet charge counters to tap the Lodestone Mirror.
Yeah, David at this point too far behind in the race to try to race. Just has to try to buy some time.
Yeah. Now Scott left back the Blinding Soul Eater here. He might be paying 2 of that Phyrexian life mana to tap the Mechanist.
Yeah, certainly. Taking 2 sounds better than taking 4. The gut shot for David Heineman, kind of a disaster in terms of draw steps. No available targets, and no available like block and upgrade. I mean, nothing there. Vapor Snag just doesn't do anything if you think about how far behind David Heineman has fallen.
Scott's board presence is continuing to grow. We know he has that court homunculus in hand in addition to anything else he might have just drawn.
There's the court homunculus. It offers up more food for the lodestone mirror, so to speak. It's joined by cranial plating.
So now Scott has access to 2 large creatures, equipping cranial plating to anything but the lodestone mirror.
Wow, so Tumble Magnet and Vapor Snag could essentially fog for 1 turn, but you don't win a game like this with fog type effects. Fog meaning just prevent damage without killing anything and without deploying anything to the board. David by himself. There's a thought. I think thought cast might be how David needs to start his next turn.
I agree. Just being able to rip into 2 of his necessary spells, but again, he doesn't have the sideboard cards like Scott has. We were talking about that Tarashi's Grasp. It's just nothing like David has that.
Yeah, Spectral Procession is a little bit interesting with Darksteel Axe. I'm just trying to think about the cards in David's deck that do more than one thing, since he's behind by so many permanents. Lodestone Mirror gets pumped in combat. Frogmite was tapped by Tumble Magnet, so it's going to be 3 from the Lodestone Mirror, 2 from the Fairy Mechanist. David Heineman falls from 15 to 10.
Yeah, Scott's still leaving the mirror out of range of a Sunlance. You notice he didn't tap the cranial plating or the court homunculus, because after he taps David's Mechanist with his Blinding Soul Eater, he still wants 2 artifacts to be able to tap the mirror.
Sure, and why take a chance?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're this far ahead, it's I don't know, a little bit safer side, I guess.
Yeah, Flayer Husk. Another weak draw step.
It's a little funny dynamic that because of the mirror, Scott's incentivized to play all of his artifacts, pre-combat. So David kind of knows maybe he doesn't have a trick necessarily, but a free Mirror Enforcer.
Wow, Mirror Enforcer. We've got, is that a Cathodian just off screen? Or no, that's the Blinding Soul Eater. So, wow, the price is right on that Mirror Enforcer. 0 mana. Adds a 4/4 to the board. Adds some more fuel for the Lodestone Mirror.
Probably going to see Scott go to combat here. David wants to tap something before that.
Yeah, and this time it's Lodestone Mirror. I think because the Germ token could potentially block Frogmite. All right, so we're seeing attack first. After attackers are declared, tap the Germ with Blinding Soul Eater. That's representing a lethal attack. If David Heineman does nothing, Scott Markeson is going to be your Grand Prix champion.
That is a 9/2.
David Heineman uses Vapor Snag on Frogmite in order to stay alive. 4 damage from the other creatures drops David to 6.
Now, if Scott was at a lesser life total, this might have been David's chance to get into the air.
With Blinding Soul Eater tap, there might have been a window. Tarashi's Grasp closes even that slight crack in Scott Markeson's game plan, putting him up to 14, removing that flying threat. So
And
there it is. There's the
it.
handshake. Scott Markeson, your Grand Prix Las Vegas 2015 champion.